Hey, welcome to React Roundup, the podcast where we keep you updated on all things React related. This show is sponsored by Raygun and produced by Top End Devs and Envoy. Top End Devs is where we create top end devs who get top end pay and recognition while working on interesting problems and making meaningful community contributions. And Envoy, which provides remote design and software development services on a task basis. So clients only pay when tasks are delivered and approved. In today's episode, we have a very special guest so that we can talk about React Native versus Capacitor. Just as an even larger intro for those of you that may not know what Capacitor is yet another technology that allows you to transform your web code so that it can run on mobile as well, similar to how React Native does it, like in terms of the final product. But they do it in very different ways. So today we're going to talk about those two technologies, what are the differences between them, and when to use each depending on your context and the context of your team and your company. My name is Lucas Paganini. I'm your host in a podcast, and joining me in today's episode is also the host, Peter Osa,
Hi everyone.
and our very special guest coming back for another episode, Jamon Holmgren.
Yeah, nice to be on again. Really nice to see you guys again.
It's great having you. For those of you that may have not listened to the previous episode where Jamon was, I think it was like 4 or 5 episodes ago, something like that. But it was an episode completely focused on React Native. So if you want to dive deeper into that, just go to the history of the show and then you go back a few episodes and you will see it. Just as a recap, Jamon is the CTO and co-founder of Infinite Red, which is a company specialized in building either from scratch or just taking a project in the middle and completing it in React Native. So this is what he does for a living. He is the perfect person to tell us the difference between those two technologies.
That is a great pitch. I should hire you to do all of our promos. That's perfect, Lucas.
We can do that. I happily accept. But yeah. All right. So, Jamin, let's get into it. Do you mind giving the audience a quick pitch, if you feel that's
Yeah.
necessary? Because I think I kind of introduced the go of capacitor, but if you feel there's anything else necessary before we get into the differences between them.
No, yeah, I think most of the time capacitor is connected to ionic, and a lot of people are probably familiar with ionic, which is, I would say, like more of a full-featured framework. And capacitor is more of like a cross-platform native runtime. A lot, and we'll talk about the similarities and differences between that and React Native. And it leans on the web technologies. But just like React Native, it has a lot of the same, kind of goals and features and whatnot. Now, I do want to tell the audience, I've been doing React Native for 8.5 years. The last capacitor or ionic project, I should say, that I've done was about that long ago. So what I know about ionic and capacitor has been from a distance or spinning up little like play apps. I haven't built apps in capacitor that are like really significant. So I always have to put that caveat out there. Like this is, this is something that I want to make sure that I do a good job of comparing the two and don't just lean on my own like experience and even my own, what my company specializes in and that sort of thing. With that said, in order to like prep for this episode, I actually reached out to my friend Jessica Sachs, who used to work for Ionic, and I went and I actually chatted with her and I said, hey, look, I really want to make sure I've got this right. And we talked for a while about what Ionic and capacitor really, like what the state of the art is in 2024. And I think I think I'm well armed for this. I think I can probably do a pretty decent job where she won't be like cringing, hopefully, if she listens to this episode.
Awesome. So you basically did a podcast to prepare for the podcast.
I should have. This was just a Twitter DM discussion, but I should have done I should have brought her on my podcast, React Native Radio. That would have been really fun. Maybe we
Yeah,
could make that happen.
definitely, definitely. Okay, awesome. We're also going to try to bring her here. I think that could be really interesting
Yeah, absolutely.
if she's into it.
I'll
Awesome.
just volunteer her. She has no knowledge of this, but
Thank you, Jessica, for being up for this.
wow. Yeah, she's really
Anyways,
up for it.
yeah. So, one interesting thing to clarify to the audience is that, as far as I'm aware of, and I am no Ionic expert myself as well, but maybe you can clarify this to me since you talked to someone that works at Ionic. For the first time that I saw Ionic, it was like 3 years ago or so, and I I thought it was a framework, but then it was presented to me in an online course as actually a UI library that compiled to the native components. And then that was my understanding at the time. And then recently, I was trying to look up Ionic, and I realized that currently Ionic itself is the company. So they named the company as Ionic, and then they have Capacitor, which is one of the products of the company called Ionic, and they have the UI library of components, which is the Ionic framework. So is that correct? Like Ionic, just Ionic is the company. Ionic framework are the UI components that also come along with Capacitor because they depend on Capacitor. And then Capacitor itself is just the build tool that can transform your web code into mobile applications, but it doesn't come with the pre-done UI components that translate to the native ones. Is that it?
I think you did a good job, and I'm going to start bumping up against because this stuff it can be kind of fuzzy, like because I mean even Ionic, like if you go to ionicframework.com, they call it Ionic. Like they say introduction to Ionic. Ionic is an open source UI toolkit, So, but I think you're right because ultimately I think that the framework itself is Ionic. There is a company Ionic. Which is, of course, maintaining it and kind of like building a business around it. And then Capacitor is really the technology that they created in order to have performant, like as performant and capable as possible bridge over to the native side. So yeah, I think you did a good job though.
Cool. And they have another interesting product called AppFlow, and they also have live updates, which I thought was really interesting. And I don't know if we're even going to get into it because I think perhaps we would need a deeper understanding of the rest of the ecosystem to even talk about that. But I was really curious to understand if AppFlow and their live deployment feature only worked with Capacitor or Ionic, or if it actually worked for React Native as well, because from their website, I see that they have logos of other tools. So if you go to their website for AppFlow, which is a product of the Ionic company, then it has a logo for Capacitor Ionic, but also for React Native and Cordova. Right. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, Ionic, interestingly, and I've chatted with some of the other Ionic folks as well, and they really have started to branch out. And like in some ways, they're sort of like the Expo of Capacitor, like they have all the other tools on top of Capacitor. That's kind of how it's not a perfect analogy, but like it's sort of like building on top of this technology, but unlike Expo, which has doubled down on React Native, they are they seem to be adopting other technologies and providing solutions across the board. So they seem to have a wider, I guess, umbrella across, React Native and their technologies and whatnot. They do provide things like the CI/CD service and more. So Yeah, it's an interesting company for sure, and I've liked all the people that I've talked to there. They're good engineers. They seem to understand, what us developers go through and whatnot.
Cool. Have you yourself ever used some of those tools that allow you to have real-time updates?
On the React Native side, I have not not so much on the Ionic side, but for sure on the React Native side, we've used them all, like on multiple projects, including rolling our own. We've had to build our own because sometimes clients will come to us and say, I want a React Native app, I want over-the-air updates, but nope, I can't use Expo, and nope, I can't use App Center, and nope, I can't use any of the other options that are out there. So we build our own, and we build something in-house and then use that. It's not actually that difficult, I would say, especially when we've done it a few times. But of course, building all the features out that you might expect from an over-there update perspective, that's where where like you get into, it's like a deep rabbit hole there.
Gotcha. But isn't that like I know we're getting into another subject, but that's really interesting because that directly solves one of the issues that we were discussing on the last episode that we talked about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is when you're dealing with native apps, you have to support the versions, or you have to force users to update and block them if they're using an old version. That's completely different from what we have on the web, where you just push and you expect.
Yeah. Sorry, I think I lost connection there. Okay.
Hey guys.
I think I'm back.
Sorry.
I
Oh, so sorry.
I'm not sure what happened there. It might have been on my end. I've been having some router issues.
Oh, that's funny because I think it was on your end, but then I thought it was on mine, and then I switched my Wi-Fi.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, hopefully we're back. Let's cross our fingers.
Yeah.
Can you re-ask that question? Sorry, I
Definitely, no worries. So I was just saying, I know that this is a bit off topic, but in the last episode we were discussing that when you're dealing with native apps, you have to support the users that are in old versions, or you need to like literally just block them and say, hey, if you want to use the app, you need to update. And that's completely different from what we have on the web, where we just assume that all users are in the latest versions. But those over-the-air updates, they fix this problem, right? But the complexity comes from the bureaucracy of getting approval from the Play Store and the App Store from Apple, because from what I understand, the thing that they are trying to prevent is companies pushing code that didn't went through their official review process, right?
Yeah.
So how do you make this allowed?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, this is a very deep subject. Of course, there's a lot of different factors here. One might ask, what right do Google and Apple have to, review this in the first place, right? Like, and that's a big discussion. They're kind of gatekeeping this and can be very arbitrary, and they've even gotten in trouble for some of their practices around this. The other thing you could say is, well, okay, so this isn't native code. This is just like JavaScript that's getting uploaded. So it's really no different than in a browser loading a new website, right? Like you can just jump to a new website. But Apple and Google seem to have different rules around browsers versus other apps. Like they seem to really kind of differentiate between the two. And certainly they have a vested financial interest in disallowing things that act like other app stores. And Epic has had these massive battles with Apple around, we should be able to provide our own app store inside of the iOS ecosystem. And so you just kind of keep going down this rabbit hole. for now, where we are is they allow it as long as you don't significantly change the like core functionality of the app or introduce things that like get around the app store and rules. And the problem is that there's really not a lot preventing people from abusing this. So when it gets abused, not if, but when it gets abused in a kind of high profile way where someone ships over the air an update that like brings in something that Apple would consider egregious, then there's probably going to be a battle around this, and they're going to start saying you can't do this. So it's something that I'm keeping a very close eye on. It's like Evan Bacon from Expo correctly says that over-the-air updates is one of React Native's killer features. It's also, by the way, Ionic capacitors killer feature too, because you can do the same thing there. But we're always a little bit leery of like overselling that, just because Apple could come in and put the hammer down. If that happens, they're going to have a battle on their hand though, and they're already fighting some battles, in the EU and other places, including the US. And so this is a whole podcast episode topic. I could go on forever about it, but there's a lot more to this story. But it basically is like, yes, it's awesome. We use it. We try not to do it in such a way that, like, if Apple came in, they would get really mad at us, just because they unfortunately are the gatekeepers here. And don't rely on it forever. Like that could be problematic. Now there is obviously the other way for submitting updates, and we can always send in a new build, and then 2 weeks later get a rejection that gives you no information about why it's rejected, and then have to guess on how to fix it. I'm not bitter at all. I'm sure you can't tell.
No, not at all. I can see that. I'm bitter for you, dude.
I've been dealing with this for oh man, it's almost like 12 years now. So
yeah. Well, although this was somewhat off topic, it's still on topic, right? Because since we're discussing differences between capacitor and React Native, one of the things that we could discuss is this over-the-air functionality. And it seems that it's not unique feature of either of both, right? You can have this with React Native. You could have this with capacitor as well.
I'm sorry. Can you ask that question again? Apologies.
Yeah, the over-the-air updates, they could be done either with React Native or capacitor. So this is one of the things that is not really a difference between them. Maybe the way that it's done can be different, but they both support it.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the benefit of both of them using a JavaScript bundle, because you can just ship a new JavaScript bundle. Now, today, most React Native apps actually ship a Hermes bytecode bundle, which is, I mean, you've probably heard of like WebAssembly, and WebAssembly has, you can like basically ship what would be sort of JavaScript, but it's in a bytecode format. Similar, I guess. If Svetlin from the Hermes team was listening to this, he would cringe because he knows all the reasons that that's wrong. But that's basically how I think about it, is that it's in those terms. But it's still kind of JavaScript under the hood. It still has the same kind of characteristics and whatnot under the hood. It's just been compiled from JavaScript. So it's a bundle. It's a file. It's a single file. Like in most cases, in the vast majority of cases, it's a one file. You literally just put it up on an endpoint and your app downloads it, just like it would download any file, replaces it or puts it in a certain spot, and then starts using that bundle, reloads, starts using that bundle instead. So that's essentially how it works.
Gotcha. Okay. So let's go into some of the differences between them. What would you say, especially after your talk with someone from the Ionic company, what would you say are the most interesting differences between React Native and capacitor, or just the entire Ionic framework?
What I like to do in these situations is really kind of help the audience understand at what level we are comparing them. Because if we're simply comparing them from a technical standpoint, like what you can achieve standpoint, then you might go one direction. But I like to look at technologies holistically. There's a lot more to a technology than just what can you achieve with what ease, with what developer experience. Certainly, those are a big part of it, and that's something I've like searched for my entire career is better solutions for doing those things. However, these apps are usually for businesses, and these businesses have constraints, and these constraints matter. So when you look at things like native versus React Native, or PWAs versus mobile at all, these all have these questions wrapped up in them around the business parts of it. And Ionic and React Native both approach this problem very pragmatically. They come at it like, hey, look, we all want good experiences, but we also understand that we have constraints, and we want to be able to ship quickly with technologies that we all know and that we can share across multiple teams. We want to enable the biggest cohort of developers, which is web, to build and deploy mobile apps. So they both really approach that from that standpoint. Now, where they differ is where they make these trade-offs and what they're willing to trade off. So I would see it in some ways as there's different levels of abstraction here. So obviously you can build a native app. You could even go lower than a native app, you're just like writing like super low level, like C or whatever. But you can write Swift and Kotlin. You can build in the native SDKs, and that gives you some benefits of like being able to customize and really fine tune at that level your apps. But the business problem is that your web developers are a little bit intimidated by like, hey, hey, build me a mobile app in both Swift and Kotlin. By the way, this isn't like a React developer who's just done JavaScript, and TypeScript. Like they're going to have to learn a lot of stuff to do that. Additionally, if you want to be like, okay, I'm going to build out my team of iOS developers and I'm going to build out my team of Android developers. Now you have 3 teams, 3 different subcultures will emerge. I've seen it every time. Like they're working together all the time. And anytime that you have teams, I mean, my own team, like, we're 30 some people. We now only do React Native. But at the time when we started, we did Elixir, we did React Web, React Native. We did a few other things too. And those subcultures would emerge. They would hang out together. They would talk together. They would like share knowledge together, but they wouldn't do it across their teams. So now you have 3 different. I remember talking to Squarespace, for example, and Squarespace had like in their office, they had, I think in New York, they had like a pod for their Android developers. They had a pod for their iOS developers. And they had a huge pod for their web developers. When they went to React Native, and this would have been the same if they went to Capacitor, they were able to re-architect literally their office, like remodel their office to combine those into a single team that was divided up in different ways, and they could all talk together, they could all help each other, etc. And so when you're talking about the trade-offs that we're making here, this is like one of the key things about Ionic and I'm going to say, whenever I say Ionic and Capacitor, just assume I'm talking about the whole thing. I don't want to have to. I'll just say Capacitor. I'll say Capacitor, even though that's like one chunk of it. All right. So anytime that you're talking about Capacitor and React Native, that's the major benefit. You bring in all the knowledge of your web developers, a lot of the tooling, not all of it, but you bring in a lot of the tooling. You can share code. Like if you have a validation function, something like that, or even just a library that you can use across the board. You can share types if you use TypeScript. Like you can say, okay, I want to use I'm consuming this API and it has this type. Okay, well, our iOS app, our Android app, and our web app all share the same types. And you can kind of go from there. And every time I see this happening at any company, it's incredibly striking how compelling that story is. It's the business case of it, and it's the organization, it's the human element that really changes there. And then there's a speed element as well, because you're building 2 to 3, sometimes plus, platforms at a time rather than rebuilding it over and over. And I've done the rebuilding over and over. I've done the web, and then now we have to build an iOS app, and now turns out people actually want Android. So, okay, we want Android, let's put it. And you're having to build it over and over and over and solve the same problems over and over and over. And it just feels like a waste of time. Like, why are we doing this over and over? Like build it once, or at most like build it twice, and you'd have web and then mobile, right? So Ionic really wants to lean toward, let's build it once, like let's use all web technologies and whatnot. So they will, like, the technology itself, for those who don't know, Capacitor is using a web view. Like, they have native bindings, but it's not for the UI. Like, the native bindings are at the they're at the API level. So you want to like get your location, or you want to access the accelerometer, or you want to like have a little like have the phone vibrate or whatever, haptic feedback. Then they'll provide native bindings for those. But then the UI itself is just rendered in a browser, so it's all the normal technologies that you're used to, like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, all in the browser, and you can use all of your web knowledge within that. React Native is not going to do that. React Native uses just JavaScript, and it has all the same like native bindings for all the device features, but the UI layer is actually building native views. And so that's the main difference. Is on Capacitor, you're going to have a web view running with a browser, and then on the React Native side, you're going to be running native views. But there's trade-offs there, because a browser, even though it's heavier, it's sort of like Electron, for example, brings with it all these benefits of using the powerful web technologies that we've developed, where React Native has to re-implement some of that stuff and make for a similar feel there. So it's really at the business level, and then you have to start thinking about the tech level and the trade-offs there, and how far, because there are limits to how far you can go with a web view. Like at some point, that like high fidelity, buttery smooth kind of feel that you want from an app, you may you're gonna probably hit a ceiling with Ionic. But that ceiling is a little higher than you think, and it also is it's not every app needs like the buttery smooth feel, because maybe you're just really tapping between screens and stuff like that.
Yep. Okay. So basically, what you're saying is, well, at least one portion of what you're saying, because there were many points touched, but one
Yeah,
thing
I kind of went
is,
on a rabbit trail there. Sorry.
yeah, no worries. But one important thing that I think we could highlight, and correct me if I'm wrong, most developers think that the ceiling that they're going to hit with going with either Capacitor or React Native is lower than it actually is. So if you're afraid of trying to build it once and ship it everywhere because you think that for some reason your application has a particular feature that is just not going to work with trying to use those hybrid technologies, in most scenarios, you're actually wrong. In most scenarios, you can actually build it hybrid and you're not going to regret it. And the chances that you're going to have a feature that is simply not supported unless you're native are extremely small, or perhaps even non-existent, because I think you can still mix and match, right, native code with hybrid.
Yeah, that's right, and you're exactly right. The ceiling is a lot higher, especially in my opinion, with React Native, and we can go into that. But because I would say that for example, the browser does limit some things with Capacitor, because you can't bring in like a native component and put it into a browser, where with React Native you literally can sprinkle every other component, could be a custom native component that you wrote in Swift or Kotlin, and just drop it right into the middle of your React Native app and it works. Like, you can do that. So that's we're starting to get into some of the trade-offs here. Ionic has a lot of benefits, and I can go into some of those, including things like it's much easier to set up than React Native. I mean, that's just, every React Native will admit that. It's true. It's like so much easier. But this is one place where you're going to hit the ceiling sooner with Capacitor. You're going to hit that level because you can't then drop into native when you need to. Now, Capacitor devs will say, how often do you actually need to do that? Like, not very often. And it is true. It's not very often. But you have that extra tool to reach for with React Native, which you would not. And that's why I think I've been very happy with React Native. I feel like it really hits that kind of sweet spot between all the convenience and whatnot, with the potential for customization.
Gotcha. Okay, that's very interesting. So with React Native specifically, let's say that I'm super hyped about the WWDC that just happened, and I want to use the latest APIs that Apple just released. I want to build for Vision OS 2. Like, the second that Apple releases it, is it already available to me? Or do I need to like wait for the latest version of React Native or whatever?
So essentially it would be available to you with some caveats. There are some situations where you might need React Native to it depends. Okay, here's the biggest question. It really comes down to, do you want React Native to support it, or do you just want the ability to put it in your app? Because as always, you can drop in a native and you can add anything you want that is supported in native, like anything bleeding edge, brand new, whatever. React Native itself might not have a binding for that, and that's fine. Like, you could, a lot of times when something comes out, people want to play with it, and you'll find a third-party library that pops out in the next week or two. Like, it happens all the time. But I have said this for many, many, many years, and I'll keep saying it until I'm blue in the face. Here's the deal. React Native developers need to not be scared to write native components. They need to not be scared of that. It's really important. I've thought about even making my own course, like, take this course and you will no longer be scared to write your own native component, because if some new feature comes out, WWDC or whatever, and you want to take advantage of it in your app, and you don't want to wait on anybody else to do this, just build it yourself. It's not that difficult. It really is not. And so yeah, there's really no lag time. No more than really, I mean, like, native apps all the time will lag on adding new features just because of engineering time. Like, you got to implement it, you got to add it in, right? No more than that. Like, and if you really, really want to do it, you just build in native and integrate it into your app. Now, if it's something that React Native should be taking advantage of, then you may wait a little bit for the core team to kind of catch up with there. You can obviously, it is open source, so you can contribute to React Native and kind of help that process along. But those are kind of few and far between. It's rare that something actually affects the core of React Native.
Gotcha. All right. I think as a last one, at least for me, in terms of things that pop up, if you go to Ionic's website, they have an article written by their CEO and co-founder, Max Lynch, and they explain the difference between Ionic React, which is the React version of the Ionic UI components, and React Native. Yeah. And one of the things that they say there, which I think is really interesting, is that they say that there's a difference between how Ionic and React Native approach cross-platform support. They say that React Native takes a learn once, write anywhere, and Ionic takes a write once, run anywhere. And basically what they're saying is that the difference is with React Native, you learn React Native and then you use it to create screens specifically for Android and specifically for iOS. And in contrast, with Ionic, you don't think about either iOS or Android. You just write it once and you trust that they're going to package and that single build is going to work for Android and iOS, which sounds cool, but then it brings so many other questions to my mind. Like this example that we were just talking about, WWDC, like Vision OS 2 only exists in the Apple ecosystem. Like it's never gonna exist in the Android ecosystem. So how do you build it once if you have something that it's only gonna exist in a particular ecosystem?
So I'll be honest. This tagline annoys me a little bit. the learn once, run anywhere. To me, I want to say this without being like too negative, but to me it feels a lot like developers trying to lower expectations so they don't get criticism. That's what it feels like. Learn once, run anywhere. Oh, we never said you could write it once and run anywhere, so don't criticize us if it doesn't work that way. I think that tagline is just wrong. I think it's just wrong based on literally like almost 100 apps that we've built over the last 9 years, like big ones, like tons of them. And we started out with React Native version 0.11. It's now up to 0.74 or 75, depending on when this comes out. And here's the deal. Like the very first apps that we started with 2 parallel projects, just to try it out, make sure it worked. We got over 80% code reuse in that very first project. It was like close to 90% code reuse between iOS and Android. Over the intervening years, we have regularly hit 100% code reuse or 99% code reuse. Like once in a great while, we'll have a little if platform OS is Android, do this, otherwise, or we might do the extension thing where it's like index.android.tsx, index.ios.tsx, and it'll render that. But it's the vast majority of the code that we write is write once, run anywhere. Vast majority. And I think it's done more harm than good. To me, it's been literally, I think that slogan is just to kind of lower expectation is all it is. And so then people will then take it very seriously and say, oh, well, we have to write every screen twice anyway, so why would we use React Native? It's not true. You just don't. Like in real life, 98%, I'll say 98%. I'll be the developer lowering expectations here. 98% of your code is going to be the same. It's going to be the code that you're going to use one component for both. And usually when you're making a differentiation, it's either because of platform differences as far as what they support, which you would have to do anyway in Ionic, or it's differences that you want to like Android users expect this to be different, so you're kind of like catering to your user base. iOS and users expect it to be this way and Android the other way. So in that case, you should write something different there. But this is a little bit of a rant. I'm sorry, but like the whole learn once, write everywhere to me is it's not a good slogan. Expo talks, Expo says create universal native apps with React that run on iOS or Android, iOS, and the web. So they, I think, have a better tagline. And to me, Expo kind of gets this a little bit better than, like meta engineers are brilliant. They're incredible engineers, not always the greatest marketers. That's not what they're, there for. And so sometimes these things, it's a very engineer type slogan, not one that I like particularly.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, in any case, Jessica from Ionic can now even have more reasons to come here and defend.
Yeah, yeah,
Basically, yeah. No, that
this
makes
is true.
sense. Okay, man. I'm sure there are thousands of other things. Do you, Peter? Please, do you have any questions?
Yeah.
Anything you want to?
Okay. Yeah. I think I have one question on the performance, right? So first of all, capacitor is like a web view, right? And also
Yep,
React Native is like native component, right? So I
that's right.
think most of the time when you go to Reddit and many forums, people usually just talk about performance, which which one actually performs better than which one, and so on and so forth. So can you give like maybe a breakdown of which one
Yeah,
you feel does best? Although actually I have my answer though, but I just want to hear yours because yeah,
yeah.
that would be cool.
It's a great question. And like I said, uh, I think up to a certain point you get the same performance or similar performance, because usually there's a lower threshold where performance, anything above that doesn't really impact the user. Like you have 60 frames per second, maybe you have 120 frames per second. If you can render 4,000 frames per second, does the user notice that? No, because the screen literally only updates 120 times per second. It's not going to update 4,000 times per second, even if you could, a human could perceive that. So within that, like if you're in the games industry and you're working within like frame rate, windows, you kind of understand around like what matters and what doesn't. If you're doing some work and then you make the frame window, like you're in that frame window, you're good. Like you're fine. Now there may be some other things that matter there, like battery life and stuff, and certainly we think about those things, but it's not the perceived performance of the app. Like that's not affected there. So that's number one. Like what matters? There's a lower bound of like it's got to be at least this. Like we got to hit the frame. We can't be skipping frames. Um, and then the other part of it would be like, what if you start getting into really heavy screens where it is not possible to like start hitting those frame rates, or there's other things that are wrong with it. And there's just one really important rule before we get into the technical limitations, which is you can write poor performing apps in any language, anywhere. I don't care if you're writing C++. I don't care if you're writing handcrafted assembly. You can write it in such a way that it's poor. It performs poorly. And because of that, there's a variety of ways to approach this, but you have like compilers that will and like JavaScript engines that will take the code that you write and try to optimize. They'll do things like inlining functions. They'll do things like memoizing things and like shortcuts and whatnot. And those can very much help. But where capacitor hits the limit is the limit of the browser that is in the system. So the web view, the web engine. So that brings with it it's a certain amount of overhead itself. And then especially on iOS, it's usually not as advanced. Google seems to take their web view a little more seriously and the engine a little more seriously. So the Android side seems to be a little faster. However, there's still limits there because, it's a web browser. So the performance of Ionic is going to be a cap at some point. You're going to hit that, or capacitor. You're going to hit that cap. You're going to hit that ceiling. React Native also has a ceiling because of, and this is kind of like in flux right now because of the new architecture, but there is a ceiling because of the JavaScript bridge, but there's a number of ways to get around that. So one is that you can run more things on the native side. So animations, for example, you craft the animation, you send the information over the bridge, and then the native side does all of the animating. Like it doesn't even hit the JavaScript side. So just have like everything running in the native side. And then obviously, if you need to, I always tell my developers, like, don't be afraid to drop in native if you need to. But vast majority of the time, just the universal truth is someone has to care. If someone cares about performance, you can get so much further before you hit the limits of the technology itself. So someone caring and spending the time will go super, super far. And then, React Native apps are native apps because you can drop in a native anytime you want and you can build anything you need to. So there should never be an excuse for poor performance in a React Native app. There might be an excuse for poor performance in a capacitor app, and that's okay. Because the way that Jess kind of described it to me when we talked about this is that she really recommends Ionic and capacitor apps for more like document focused apps, like apps that are more like around content like that. If you're talking about app focused apps like that need like really smooth animations and scrolling and think something like, I don't know, Duolingo or Instagram or something like that, then it makes sense to maybe go with something else. And React Native, of course, would be a prime thing there. But performance really isn't an excuse with React Native. There should never be something that you can't achieve with React Native in as far as performance. And I will say, just a shout out for my own company, Infinite Red, if you have trouble hitting that performance, then come talk to us, because there's no reason why you can't get there. And certainly if you have us build alongside you all the way, we'll teach you how to build performant apps like that. That's part of what we do.
Yeah, that's a very nice answer. Yeah, I think I'm actually very quite satisfied with that. Yeah, because the web view aspect was really like, it was actually a point I actually noticed, because that was something that I felt that, yeah, if capacitor was going to have like a bottleneck, that would be where it will be, right? Because the limit of the web view. And so yeah, I think you kind of went through that very well. Yeah, I think the answer is quite great. Yep.
Yep.
All right. Jamon, I'm going to throw in a catch-all question just before we wrap things up. Do you think there's anything that you would like to mention that perhaps we haven't asked and you think would be relevant for this subject?
Yeah. I think when you're thinking about the subject of capacitor versus React Native, one of the biggest questions you should be asking yourself is your team makeup and the business needs. And I mentioned this before. Now, if you're using something like Angular and you would love to continue to use Angular, and just kind of keep that rolling throughout your organization, then you can consider something like Ionic and capacitor, because that would be, that'd be a possibility there. If you are using React, I know that there's Ionic React, but I think you should strongly consider React Native just because of the flexibility. There are some other like Vue Native and Svelte Native and stuff like that try to build on top of React Native. However, they're not the greatest supported, generally speaking. So I would say if you're insisting on using something other than React, then yeah, consider Ionic and capacitor. If you're using React, use really Expo. You should be really looking at Expo, and it's going to be hard to beat the combination there. I think it really makes good trade-offs. I'm still a huge fan of React Native after all these years, which normally I move on to another technology after 5 years, and this is like almost double that now. So yeah, very much. I think I think where, and I can help you make that decision if you're a company. Talk to me. I'm more than happy to chat about it. But I always try to have like, I don't want to be unfair to these other technologies. There's reasons. It's as like the joke is like, it depends, right? Like it's a trade-off discussion and whatnot. And for my particular values and what I want to hit, business wise, as well as technology and developer experience wise, I really think React Native makes sense. But obviously there are totally valid reasons to use something like capacitor and Ionic.
Okay, makes sense. Talking about this, let's do some promos and talk a little bit more about what it is that you do, because that was mentioned in the beginning. But just to reiterate, besides being the CTO and co-founder of a company that is specialized in React Native. So
Mhm.
as Jamon was just saying, any company that is even considering exploring this route should definitely check out Infinite Red's website and contact them. Besides that, you also do lots of content, right?
Mhm.
And I think some of them even produced and sponsored by Infinite Red. I know there's a conference that's going to happen, I think in July. Perhaps you can talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, that's right. So Chain React, this will be the 5th edition of Chain React. It is purely React Native conference. So if you go there, you're going to be surrounded by React Native developers or people who are interested in React Native. All of the talks, it's single track 2-day conference in Portland, Oregon. It's all React Native. It's the people, from Meta, from Microsoft, from Amazon, all these big companies that are using React Native will be there. You're going to be rubbing elbows. It's only going to be like 300-ish people, so like it's not a ton of people. It's a small kind of tight knit community. You're going to get a chance to meet everybody, including myself. And you're going to see a bunch of bunch of Infinite Red and React Native engineers running around with red shirts, so you can talk to any of them. So it is July. We have a workshop day on the 17th, and then the 18th and 19th of July are our talk days. So we have a bunch of exciting stuff kind of planned for that. So go to chainreactconf.com and get your tickets there. I'd love to see you all at Chain React in Portland, Oregon. And then we do a lot of other content. I have a YouTube channel, although I haven't put out a video for a little while. I do need to do that. But it's called Jamon's Code Quests, and I go kind of spelunk through stuff. I explain stuff. It's kind of fun. And you can also go to my Twitch stream, just my first and last name, Jamon Holmgren, on Twitch. I do stream from time to time. And I have a podcast, React Native Radio, which is all about React Native. We just crossed our 300th episode, which is fun. And I think you folks are, how many episodes have you done now? It's up there as well.
It's pretty close. It's, I think, 270 or something.
Yeah, you've done a ton. So there's a lot of React Native content there, and we interview lots of people, lots of different topics. It's pretty much the biggest React Native podcast. And we have a React Native newsletter, so reactnativenewsletter.com. I don't know. I could keep going. I don't want to bore everybody. You can go to infinite.red and click through our website. You'll see it all. It's there.
Awesome. Okay. And Peter, how about you? Would you like to bring up anything?
Yeah, not really much though. I just wrote, I think recently wrote an article on Playwright. I think I was just experimenting on React testing. So I just wrote something on Playwright. So yeah, I think that's just it. Maybe you can just check it out. I dropped the link on the chat. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. I also sent some of the links in the comment section for those of you that are watching us from YouTube or any of the other live streaming platforms. There should be something in the comment section. First for Chain React Conf. If you're not, then it's just chainreactconf.com. There's also the website for Infinite Red.
Mm-hmm.
It's literally just infinite.red. So, I mean, you can't really go wrong with that.
Exactly.
And I'm also going to send the article that Peter just mentioned. On my end, I'm just going to, again, touch upon the companies that produce the show. So Top End Devs produces all the podcasts in this top end umbrella, React Roundup being one of them. But we also have shows about Angular, Ruby on Rails, CI/CD. Anyways, there's a bunch of stuff. So do check out Top End Devs. You can go to the website and see all the shows available. And Unvoid, which provides remote design and software development services. But if you're looking for React Native, then don't consider Unvoid. Just go straight to Infinite Red. But for other inquiries, do check out unvoid.com. This is unvoid.com. And what's interesting is that instead of paying per hour, you only pay per task. and you pay only after the tasks are delivered and approved. So it's not just they delivered and you pay, you actually do quality control before you commit to paying to them. So it's on their best interest to deliver you quality work fast. So that means that all the biggest pain points that companies usually have with software outsourcing are just gone when you work with that model. So do check out if you're interested in that. That's it for me. Thank you for sticking up to the end. We're almost at 1 hour. You could have changed this episode, the episode of this podcast, for one episode of House of the Dragon, which, by the way, I encourage you to do eventually because it's really good this new season. So, yeah, thank you for sticking with us for so long, and I will see you in the next one.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Yes, guys.